2025 National NRDAR Workshop. Official logo of the U.S. Department of the Interior, March 3, 1849. Official logo of ORDA, IEC. Presentation includes photos of many different types of songbirds throughout. Christian Crowley is the host.
Welcome back. Hope you had a good break. I wanted to let you know we're going to be recording this, the rest of our sessions for today. So if you'd like to avoid being recorded, just please keep your cameras off. So welcome back. I'm excited to get into our next sessions. Here's what we have on offer for the rest of today. We'll learn first about songbird restoration with Dr. Michelle Beck and Dr. Daniel Cristol, and then we'll learn about using trophic transfer to assess PFAS injuries in freshwater systems. We'll learn about NRDAR regs with a friendly Kahoot quiz game, and then we'll hear about the successful first year of the Tribal Apprenticeship Program. So let's go ahead and get started. Our next session is Considerations for Songbird Restoration in NRDAR with Dr. Daniel Cristol and Dr. Michelle Beck. So I'll just give a quick introduction for these folks. Dr. Cristol is Chancellor Professor in the Department of Biology at William & Mary. He specializes in avian ecotoxicology and contaminant movement through food webs. He has over 35 years of experience in the field and has supported injury assessments and restoration planning efforts for avian resources in multiple NRDARs. The bulk of his career has been spent studying the effects of mercury on birds, and he is currently finishing a study on how aquatic mercury enters the terrestrial food web of wolf spiders, a favorite food of songbirds. Dan is also an avid bird watcher and brings his experience with observing and studying behavior into his ecotoxicology. We're looking forward very much to hearing from Dr. Cristol. And his co-presenter is Dr. Michelle Beck. She is a senior associate at IEC with a strong background in wildlife ecotoxicology and ecology. She received her Bachelor of Science in Biology and Ecology and Environmental Science from Appalachian State University. She has a Master of Science in Biology from Auburn University and a doctorate in zoology from Washington State University. As a postdoctoral research associate at Virginia Tech, she assessed the effects of selenium and other metals on songbird reproduction, survival, and physiology. She has over 18 years of experience in these fields and supports ecological injury quantification and restoration scaling efforts for NRDARs. So welcome, Dr. Cristol and Dr. Beck.
Thank you. I'm not sure if the host can turn my camera on. I'm unable to do it from my end here.
We were just discussing that in our side chat. We wonder if we're maybe not able to do it for external folks. And if that's the case, I'm very sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. So I'm going to get started and answer the question of why we're even talking about songbirds today.
Slide lists several examples of scientific journal articles about songbirds and toxicology, including 2 that were co-written by this webinar speakers. Cover image of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring.
Songbirds are frequently part of NRDA cases because they're frequently injured, and they're also an attractive target for restoration. Birds have a long history of being used as indicators of environmental contamination, all the way back to Silent Spring when Rachel Carson alerted us to what DDT was doing to robins and other birds. They've been at the forefront of the fledgling environmental movement, and they've been part ever since. They're relatively easy to study compared to, say, undersea organisms or things that come out at night, and they're often very sensitive to contaminants, a wide variety of them, particularly during early development when they're trapped inside the egg with those contaminants. Birds are found almost everywhere, particularly songbirds. They feed in practically every niche, and they integrate contaminants across a big chunk of the food web. There's numerous lab and field studies that have documented adverse effects of contaminants on songbirds and other bird species. So they're often a resource in NRDA cases. Perhaps most importantly, there's 96 million bird watchers in the US, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service's 2022 survey. That's 1 in 3 Americans. So birds have a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of people care about birds besides just scientists. What are songbirds? Well, technically, they're a taxonomic group, the most recent group of birds to evolve, and they comprise about half of all living species in the world. That bird on the left, the common yellowthroat with the yellow and black and brown body, that's a typical songbird. It's a warbler. But there are lots of other birds that have really similar ecological traits to songbirds, and so we consider them in this talk, we talk about them as being songbirds as well. For example, that downy woodpecker on the right side of the slide, that's a small bird that defends its territory with vocalizations, just like a songbird. It disperses from the place that it was hatched. Some woodpeckers migrate, these in particular do not. They are capable of rapid reproduction. They eat insects. They have 4 eggs in a nest, just like the common yellowthroat on the left side. So it would be silly to consider this yellowthroat a songbird and not also consider its ecologically very similar relatives who are not technically songbirds. So we talk about them all as songbirds. And then there's birds in the middle, like the one in the middle, the spotted sandpiper. That doesn't look much like a songbird at all, but it's a neotropical migrant. It disperses from the place that it was born. It's territorial. It defends its territories with vocalizations. It has a nest with 4 eggs in it and eats bugs. So basically, it is also ecologically just like a songbird, and they often would be considered a target for restoration for songbird injury as well. So there are birds like seabirds, waterfowl, herons, raptors, and game birds that don't fit well in the framework that we're presenting here today. But it could be adjusted for those species as well. However, most birds really ecologically are quite similar to the true songbirds. So what are the typical habitat considerations that one would look for when thinking about a good restoration project for songbirds that have been injured due to contaminants? A really important one is habitat connectivity. So this a project in the middle of this matrix of green on the left would be better than a bunch of small isolated postage stamps across the landscape, because songbirds, because they are very dispersive, they need a metapopulation of connected similar habitats with some level of protection. So putting a restoration project in the middle of other protected habitat is a really good idea. Secondly, development pressure is really important to consider. If you preserve a large wetland as your restoration project, it probably was already protected by other laws, and it's not very buildable because of flooding. And so the birds that are produced at that protected wetland would have been produced anyway into the future, and really aren't offsetting the injury, as well as, say, having preserved the forest that all those houses are on in the middle of this, in the middle picture of this slide. Those houses are preventing any songbirds from being produced in that habitat. And so had it been protected, all of the songbirds produced there into the future would count to offset the injury due to contamination at another site. And this would have been a very valuable, cost-effective project that produced a lot of songbird years into the future. A third consideration is the vulnerability of your site to extreme events. We've already heard a lot about hurricanes and tropical storms today. There's also fires. There's many other things that we didn't necessarily face in the past that projects now face in the future, such as getting inundated with salt water, or diseases or invasive species that are moving across the country. So it would be foolish to plan one of these projects without thinking far into the future about what is going to happen. And we, of course, already have seen that with the hurricanes hitting those wonderful beach nourishment projects that we heard about earlier today. A final consideration that's really important and sometimes overlooked is that there should be a connection, some sort of connection to the injury site. Now, I'm not talking about a physical connection, because the injury site may be very contaminated and not a place that you'd want to restore songbirds. However, if it's on a river upstream of the contamination site, might make a very good connected restoration site, because there's a connection for the stakeholders, for the people who live there. And so all the bird benefits are also enjoyed by the some of the stakeholders who are connected to that site geographically. at least it should be, it's often these sites are within the same political boundaries, so within the same state anyway, to satisfy those stakeholders. With birds, you have the possibility of protecting them at either their breeding site or at the place they migrate to, their wintering site, where they actually spend the bulk of the year, 8 months of the year, or you could protect migration stopover sites in between. So you have a lot of different options, some of which are more connected to the injury site than others, and so might be more palatable to your stakeholders and more attractive to the people that that love these birds. So songbirds have some particular traits that are often not something you have to consider with other species that you're trying to restore. And one of these is that many species of songbirds, like that prothonotary warbler in the middle there, are nesting in cavities. So these are holes in trees that are hollowed out by woodpeckers for their nests and then abandoned, and then maintained often by fungus or other organisms. And you could produce a beautiful habitat for prothonotary warblers with all the food they needed, but they won't reproduce unless there are appropriate nest cavities. And that means that trees have to be mature, and that takes many, many decades often if you're restoring, say, abandoned farmland into a forest. So you might not get any gains of prothonotary warblers at your restoration site for many, many decades, unless you install nest boxes, which are artificial tree cavities that many, many songbirds will use. This, of course, introduces the need for people to maintain those boxes, clean them out, monitor them, and make sure that other species are not nesting in them or that there are enough for all of the species. So nest boxes for cavity nesting songbirds is something that needs to be considered in any project, whether you're going to go do that or not, because of the successional nature and the long time period it takes for cavities to form. Another example of a habitat need of songbirds is for grassland birds, which are often the target of restoration because grassland birds are not doing well nationally. That bobolink on the left will nest in grasslands. They're pretty easy to restore, but they're very hard to maintain. So the bobolinks will come, but unless there's fire, mowing, or grazing, then there will no longer be grasslands there in a few years, and your gains of bird years per acre for bobolinks will go down to zero very quickly. So that means that there has to be a long-term plan with local partners to monitor and maintain that habitat you're putting in its successional state, or it will, of course, move out of those early successional stages. Finally, you got to remember with birds, as I've mentioned already, you have breeding areas, you have wintering areas where they spend most of the year, and you have all the places that they stop in between. And one has to figure out which part of the annual cycle you're targeting with your project. You have all three options, and sometimes protecting at multiple sites to protect different parts of the annual cycle makes sense. Sometimes you can get a lot more bang for your buck if you do something on the wintering grounds, which are often in tropical habitats, but those are outside of the United States often. So that's a consideration.
A map from Cottonwood Post showing breeding ranges for the Carolina wren in the U.S. in years 1980, 2000, and 2020, each represented by a colored line. The bottom red line, 1980, spans from Kansas through southern Michigan and through New Hampshire. The orange line, 2020, is much further north, spanning from North Dakota, north of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, to Nova Scotia.
Additional considerations that are particular songbirds that I just want to mention before I turn it over to Michelle are that bird populations are really dynamic, especially songbird populations. They can respond quickly to changes in temperature and moisture regimes. And so birds that were present at the injury site may no longer be present there and may not be present at nearby restoration sites because the population has changed continent-wide. Perhaps it's collapsed due to external factors. Or there's a whole bunch of songbirds that are moving northward very rapidly. Their breeding ranges are moving northward. For example, the Carolina wren, shown here in this map, the bottom red line is the northern extent of where Carolina wrens were in 1980, around when circular was passed. But now Carolina wrens are up at that orange line. And so if you're working on a project in the northern tier of states, there may not have been Carolina wrens to be injured if it's a legacy site, but they may be very easy to restore and produce a lot of Carolina wrens now because they've moved northward. So that's something to consider, how you deal with restoring something that wasn't present or vice versa. Secondly, and probably more of a problem, is the idea of that habitats change due to vegetation changes that are occurring in this country. One of them is that tree species are disappearing because of or have disappeared at many sites because of blights, but more commonly it's invasive species like this Japanese knotweed that have come in and really altered the habitat. Japanese knotweed loves river banks that have been somewhat disturbed, and it produces massive monocultures that people don't really like. But some birds really love Japanese knotweed stands, in particular the gray catbird, which is a frequent bird injured at contaminated sites, and so a frequent neotropical migrant target of restoration. If a restoration plan is to come in and take out all of the invasive species, including the Japanese knotweed, you will actually reduce the number of songbirds present at that site considerably, breeding songbirds, by replacing that with native species. Now, there may be some big advantages of putting in native species, but your overall production of songbird years may actually go down. You may actually increase the injury with your restoration. So these are complicated things to figure out and require some real knowledge of the sites and the biology of these birds. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to walk you through a restoration scaling example that illustrates the importance of considering these things that I've been talking about, as well as very much shows the importance of conversion potential or the development pressure on an area. So take it away, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So in this example that we're going to go through, we're going to assume that a RIA was used and that injury and restoration benefits are quantified in bird years lost and bird years gained, respectively. Both injury quantification and restoration scaling require population model output, and that model output depends on field surveys to determine the density of each species in the area. And we're going to talk a lot about these surveys because they are a really important component of this process. So the number of surveys determines the degree to which the population model output is going to be habitat specific. Fewer surveys are going to produce a model output that represents the average density of a given species across all the habitat types that are in the assessment area. So if you imagine an assessment area that's a mixture of, say, riparian areas, grassland, upland forest, and shrubland, what the population model output gives you is an average density across all those various habitat types. Now, you could perform more surveys and target specific habitats when you perform those surveys, and then that's going to produce a density that is specific to a particular habitat type. And what this can mean for restoration is that prior to restoration planning, the parcels or habitats to be preserved are unknown, and you aren't going to have density estimates for these areas. So one approach is to rely on the surveys that are performed during injury quantification. But if those are only going to provide the average density of a species across a mixture of habitats, then in the assessment area, you're going to have to make an adjustment, right? Because when you go in to preserve a particular habitat, it likely consists primarily of one type of habitat. It's primarily a grassland or it's primarily an upland forest. And so you may need to adjust the density estimates with these species-specific suitability adjustments that we're going to talk about in a moment. An alternative would be to do surveys of the habitats that are targeted for preservation, and that would provide a density estimate for those parcels and eliminate the need for any suitability adjustment. So this model shows the inputs needed and the process for scaling an avian restoration project, and we're going to walk through this starting over on the left side. So we already mentioned these songbird surveys that are needed, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those in a couple more slides because, again, they're very important. We're also going to need life history parameters, which can be acquired from the ornithological literature for each species. These are going to be used in a population model to obtain the predicted density of each species. And in this example, we're going to assume that the level of survey effort provided an average density in the mixture of habitats that make up the assessment area, and that there were no surveys performed in the parcels that are being targeted for habitat preservation. Population model output is going to be a predicted density of songbirds in that typical assessment area habitat, which is a mixture of habitats. So now when habitat preservation projects are selected, the parcels are predominantly going to be, again, perhaps one type of habitat or another. So let's say that habitat 1 is a preferred habitat for a given species. Then in that case, the suitability score assigned to that species would be a 1 for that habitat type. And that's because it's going to reproduce and survive very well in that habitat type. And you're going to get the maximum number of songbird years gained that is possible for that species from that habitat. But let's say habitat 2 is a less preferred habitat, or the species may only be able to use a portion of that habitat. So for instance, if it's a bird that really likes shrubs, and this is a forested habitat, the shrubs are only going to occur along the borders or edges of that habitat, or so the suitability score in that case may be a 0.5 because it's only able to use a portion of the habitat for breeding. And that will also produce a certain number of songbird years gained. But both of the habitat projects, or both projects, will produce some songbird years for that species. And those suitability adjustments, I'm going to just say that they're going to be based on, again, the ornithological literature. They can be based on site-specific observations that are made, especially during the songbird surveys, that can then inform how you toggle that suitability for each species.
Illustration shows a skilled observer in the center of an area with many different types of plants and 6 songbirds. 3 of the songbirds are located a distance away and behind different plants, making it so the observer is unable to see them.
So we're going to spend a couple more slides talking about those surveys because they are a really key part of this. So in our example here, we have a skilled observer. So this is someone like Dan who can go out and identify birds by sight and by sound. That person is going to spend a specified amount of time in this location, and they're going to identify every single species within a certain area around them. For each of those species, they're going to count the number of individuals of each species that they observe. And very importantly, they're going to record the distance between themselves and the birds they observe. So in our little cartoon here, there are actually 6 different birds of the species that this person could count. But what you can see is that during the period that they were there, they only detected 3 of those birds and included them in their count. And so this is where distance-corrected sampling is going to come in. Distance-corrected sampling is going to correct for the missed birds by incorporating a probability of detection for each species. And that considers the distance between the detected birds and the observer. This is going to indicate how the birds that were detected clustered around the observer. And it's going to be unique to each person performing a count. And it's also going to depend on other factors about the site, such as habitat density or structure and the ambient noise level. So that makes detection probabilities really site-specific. You can't go to a published study, pull a detection probability out of it, and apply it to another site. That's not an appropriate thing to do. So these detection probabilities, because they're site-specific, it makes doing these surveys at the assessment area or a very key component of the population model for injury quantification and for scaling restoration. There may be a temptation to use avian count data in some cases, but they can't be used here either because you can't get an accurate density estimate from those types of data sets. And that's because there's no information about the distance between the observer and the bird, so no information on how the detections cluster around the person who did that count. Some examples of count data that wouldn't be appropriate to use in the population model are things like eBird and breeding bird surveys. So we're going to walk through some additional considerations as we finish putting together this approach before we walk through the example. So some of the things to consider throughout the whole process, obviously, are trustee priorities and the feasibility of the restoration options. This can include things like targeting parcels or habitats that are of particular interest to trustees. So something that's at a very high risk of development or something that's very rare in the area already, say a grassland, because people tend to develop those at a very high rate. Those might be targeted to have some other habitat types. While a single habitat type or a particular suite of habitat projects might be really beneficial to the injured songbirds, you may only be able to purchase a small portion of a particular type of habitat. Maybe there's just not that much upland forest, even though it's very beneficial to all the species that were injured. So you have to have other projects that you can turn to address the rest of the avian injury. There are also habitat maintenance requirements. Dan alluded to this earlier in the presentation. So if you think about any early successional stage habitat, it's going to require maintenance to maintain it in that state. And that's going to require funds. It's going to require an invested party who's going to make sure that that maintenance occurs. So for like a grassland, that mowing or burning are performed to keep it in a grassland state. Another thing that Dan mentioned earlier, and that we're going to touch on more here now, is this idea that only areas where there's a high risk of conversion are you going to really get benefits to songbirds. If an area is already protected, you're just not going to get the same benefits to songbirds. And this is where land change modeling can come in to help you incorporate this risk into your restoration scaling. So these land change models use spatial analysis to identify parcels that transition from habitat to no habitat over time. And this can provide a habitat-specific conversion potential in the area that is targeted for restoration, or you might use your whole assessment area to calculate these conversion potentials. So you can just imagine looking at, a patch of grassland and a patch of forest, and over time seeing, how often they convert to a shopping mall or a housing development. We could have a whole presentation about this approach and how to use it, and I would not be the right person to give that presentation. But if you have any questions about this, we'll do our best to answer them, or we can put you in contact with a couple of my colleagues at IEC, Emily Evenen and Chip Patterson, who are the masterminds behind this particular part of the model. We've already talked a lot about these species-specific habitat requirements and using that suitability adjustment, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that again here. But once you have all these different pieces, you're able to begin to identify the habitat types that will provide benefits for each of the injured species, the combination of those that will address the injury, and then you can move into scaling. And so now we're going to walk through an example with some numbers. So I will first say that this example is completely made up. It's not based on any case that we've worked on, but we have 3 birds that were injured. We have a bobolink, a common yellowthroat, and a planetary warbler. The D is the population model output, is telling you the density of bobolinks or any of the other species in 1 acre of habitat.
D, density per songbird, bobolink, 1. Common yellowthroat, 1.5. Prothonotary warbler, 2.
So there are 3 different potential habitat preservation projects that we could do. There's a grassland projects, bottomland hardwood forest, and then an upland forest. And the conversion potentials are all here on each of the little pictures. You can see that the grassland has the highest conversion potential, and the bottomland hardwood forest has the lowest conversion potential.
Conversion potential, CP, per habitat. Grassland, 0.6. Bottomland hardwood forest, 0.25. Upland forest, 0.4.
Everything in the little chart down here, these are our suitability scores. So we'll start with our little bobolink. It's a grassland bird, so not surprisingly, it's going to get a 1 for a suitability score for the grassland. And it is a grassland bird, so it's not going to breed in either the forest habitats, and it's going to get a 0 for the suitability score. Our prothonotary warbler down here is going to be very happy in a bottomland hardwood forest. It's going to be not breed in a grassland and probably not going to find a good spot in an upland forest. So it's going to only have a 1 for the bottomland hardwood forest. Common yellowthroat is a species that's a bit more flexible. So this is a species that just likes really thick shrubby areas. It prefers them to be around water, but it's okay if it's just like thick shrubby stuff somewhere along the edge of a field or along the edge of a forest. So it's actually going to get a 0.5 for its suitability score for each of these different projects. Now, on the next slide, we're actually going to start walking through some numbers and some slides with totals on them. And I'll say that the other thing that I did in this example is I quantified benefits over 50 years and I applied discounting. So if you start trying to do the math in your head, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get the same numbers I did unless you can discount in your head, which is going to be very impressive. So the first thing I want to focus on here is just how important the conversion potential is when you are doing this type of exercise. So we're just looking at the prothonotary warbler, and if you don't consider the conversion potential and you just think about what kind of how many species years you get back by saving 1 acre of bottomland hardwood forest, the answer is you would get 54 prothonotary warbler years. But when you consider the conversion potential, because the conversion potential for a bottomland hardwood forest was low, the lowest one, maybe it's already protected, maybe it floods, periodically, so no one wants to put development projects on it. you're only going to get 13 prothonotary warbler years from that project. So this is just showing, this is the species that showed the largest drop. And so I just wanted to highlight that as how important the conversion potential is. So on the next graph, we'll look at all the different species with all the habitat types. So we're going to walk through this slowly. So first, we'll start with a little legend up here. So anything in green, the green bars are the grasslands. The blue bars are going to be the bottomland hardwood forest, and the more aqua-colored bars are the upland forest. And the solids are the bird years gained from 1 acre of that habitat over 50 years with no conversion potential. And then the stripes include the conversion potential. Now let's just start off by focusing on our common yellowthroat here, because this is a species that was able to nest and breed in all 3 of the habitats equally well. And what you can see here is that while all 3 projects look like they would be equally beneficial to the common yellowthroat, again, when you consider the conversion potential, it's the grassland that provides the most common yellowthroat year benefits, while followed by the or upland forest, with the bottomland hardwood forest coming in last. And the nice thing about the grassland is it has the added benefit of being the one habitat that will compensate for the injury to the bobolink.
Bobolink only shows grassland with the no conversion potential bar being higher than the with conversion potential bar. Prothonotary warbler only shows bottomland hardwood forest, with the no conversion potential bar being more than 3 times higher than the with conversion potential bar. Common yellowthroat shows all 3 habitats, each with equal no conversion potential bars, but unequal with conversion potential bars, which are either half or less than half of the full bar's sizes.
So how does this all come together in terms of like what would actually need to be acquired to restore each of the species? So we're going to assume in this example that there were 5,000 present value lost songbird years. So for the bobolink, that means that there need to be 312 acres of grassland preservation. For the prothonotary warbler, there need to be 374 acres of bottomland hardwood forest preservation. And again, a lot of that difference is coming from the difference between the conversion potential for the grassland and for the bottomland hardwood forest. But what about the common yellowthroat? How many acres of habitat and which habitat would need to be preserved? Well, the actual answer is going to be 0. And that's because the grassland project for the bobolink and the bottomland hardwood forest project for the prothonotary warbler addressed all of the injuries to the common yellowthroat. So no additional projects are going to be needed to compensate for their injury. So this is our last slide, just to kind of summarize everything. There are several benefits to this approach. First, it's going to account for all the species years gained from each of the habitats. And most of the habitats are going to provide years for multiple species. It makes it a cost-effective and flexible approach because avian restoration can be accomplished through the inclusion of a variety of habitat types. It also really highlighted the importance of considering the conversion potential. Habitats that are less likely to be converted provide fewer songbird benefits. It also accounts for songbird life histories and the dynamics of their populations and habitats. And I think if we have time, we're happy to answer any questions that anyone might have, but I'm not sure if we have time.
How about a round of applause for Dr. Cristol, Dr. Beck? Any questions, folks?
Okay, it looks like we have one question in the chat. And a couple hand raised. So given all of the funding constraints of these times, how feasible would it be for the state tribe trustees to get assistance performing RIAs? As we know, the time and investment to make one of these is a lot. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that compared to the cost of acquiring the habitat and restoring it, the costs of doing this are probably not a lot because they're just done by a couple people sitting in front of a computer. And since there's many of these have been done, it's not necessarily starting from scratch. If it does require field work because people have not counted and estimated the populations of birds at the injury site or the potential for the restoration site, then that's more. But I don't think the cost of these are prohibitive compared to the cost of actually doing the work. So look that way, I think it is important, because doing the work without doing this might be throwing away a lot of money. I don't know if you have more to add, Michelle.
Michelle shakes her head.
All right, thank you. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, apologies if you mentioned this and I missed it, but you mentioned development being an impact on songbirds. What about agriculture? Do you have any sense of how much ag impacts songbird populations?
Yes, I'm sure Michelle may want to comment as well, but it's more about the structural change in the habitat. So if a forest is cut down for agricultural fields, then there's a complete changeover, so a complete loss of what was present, and a few birds may thrive in the agriculture area, but only if it's not if it's intensive agriculture, which is going to have very few birds indeed. So in fact, housing developments and agriculture, in studies that I've done, support approximately the same densities and diversity of birds, and it's much lower than what you get in a forest. Although you do attract in species that weren't present before, so it's not as simple as just a reduction. But yes, agriculture is pretty devastating to songbirds that were present before the agriculture. Although if it's low-level, non-intensive agriculture such as hay fields and pastures, then there can be lots and lots of songbirds present.
And I will just add that the conversion potential that could include conversion to agriculture. So it doesn't necessarily have to be conversion to like a housing development. It can be captured in that factor as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you for those answers. We do have another one in the chat, but we are out of time, so we're going to have to move on. If you could take the time to go to the Q&A and answer those for our attendees, that would be amazing.
Michelle nods her head. Next session, PFAS trophic transfer in freshwater aquatic systems. Injury determination methods for natural resources. Dr. Jeff Morris.
Many thanks, Dr. Cristol, Dr. Beck, for sharing some interesting information about what it takes to restore songbirds. This topic is particularly timely since John Eisenhart reminded us that the spring edition of World Migratory Bird Day was this weekend, Saturday, May 10th. And the autumn edition of World Migratory Bird Day is coming up on October 11th, so get your binoculars ready.